Welcome, everyone. Please welcome Dr. Ralph Engelman, Faculty Coordinator for the George Polk Awards.
Welcome to the George Polk Awards
Welcome,
webinar on the press and the pandemic, filling the information void, with Polk Award winners David Culver of CNN, Helen Branswell of STAT, and Ed Young of The Atlantic. I also welcome you on behalf of Dr. Kimberly Klein, President of Long Island University, home of the Polk Awards, on behalf of John Darnton, Curator of the Awards, and our institutional partner, the Center for Communication. A quick word about our moderator. Laurie Garrett is a two-time Polk Award winner and a former Polk seminar panelist. Acclaimed reporter for KPFA-FM in Berkeley, and then for Newsday New York, fellow at the Harvard School of Public Health. She created the Global Health Program at the Council on Foreign Relations. Her body of work includes groundbreaking analysis of the outbreaks of HIV/AIDS, SARS, Ebola, and COVID-19. Her prophetic best-selling book, The Coming Plague: Newly Emerging Diseases in a World Out of Balance, was published in 1995. And now to Laurie Garrett.
Hello, it's a pleasure. Thank you so much, Ralph. And greetings to everyone who's joining us on this historic moment when we're seeing infectious disease coverage glean a bastion of awards from the great Polk Awards. And for those of you who may not be journalists and may not be familiar with the Polk Award, just let me tell you that it is really similar to getting a Screen Actors Award versus an Oscar. The Oscar may be the glamorous one, but the Screen Actors means your peers judged you and your peers decided that you excelled. And so today we're really looking at people who did magnificent work as judged in the scrutiny of fellow journalists. They are Helen Branswell from STAT. And though some of you may not be familiar with STAT, it is now the go-to online publication for medical and clinical science coverage. It has grown astonishingly in the last 4 or 5 years. And really, both scientists and the general public are addicted to it and should be. And Helen Branswell is one of their top lead reporters. We also are honoring David Culver from CNN. And of course, CNN, I need not describe. I'm sure every one of you has watched it many times. David's work started out covering from the United States, but he's now based in China. And he comes to us today from Shanghai. And then Ed Young from The Atlantic. And again, not a publication I need to tell you anything about. I'm sure you all are very familiar with The Atlantic. And David has come to us today from Washington, D.C., and we'll get a little bit into his background further on in our conversation. So I'm going to be bringing you a very deep dive into the COVID epidemic. We're going to start with where it began and then move on until by the end, when we open this up for your questions, we will have completed a discussion looking ahead. Where is this all going? As we go, you may have a question hit you, something you want to ask. You go down to the bottom of your screen, wave your cursor along the very bottom, and you'll see a little icon come up. It says chat. You enter your question there, and people from the Polk committee, not me, will select whose questions will be addressed. So please feel free to stick your questions in there at any moment. So I want to begin at the beginning. It's New Year's Eve day, 2019. So just after Christmas of 2019. And Helen Branswell, on that auspicious day, rather than being in the middle of frivolity and what have you, sends out this tweet. Hopefully this is nothing out of the ordinary, but a ProMed posting about, quote, unexplained pneumonias in China is giving me SARS flashbacks. Helen came out of Canada. She is Canadian. She was a lead reporter for the Toronto Star when SARS emerged in 2003, and then went on to report for a number of different organizations in Canada before joining us down here in the lower, the subterranean nation of America below Canada, moving to Boston, where she is joining us today. You were in the middle of SARS in Toronto in 2003. You did stellar reporting on a situation that really shocked the world because everybody thought, well, a rich country with universal healthcare like Canada will have no problem getting rid of this virus. This is going to be a problem for poorer countries. And indeed, Canada really struggled to bring SARS under control. So what was it that you were seeing in the last week of December 2019 that was beginning to make your skin crawl, and that by January 4th had you publish your first article in Stat saying, looks like we have a problem?
Well, I should be clear that on December 31st, when I saw that ProMed posting, I didn't know we were going to be getting to where we are now. I just knew that when you hear word out of China that they're starting to see cases of pneumonia that they can't diagnose, you've got to take that seriously, because since SARS, since H5N1 bird flu, since H7N9 bird flu, they've had these outbreaks over the last 15 or 20 years. Their surveillance systems for pneumonia are really good. They pick up pneumonias and they are able to diagnose them. And if they didn't know what they were looking at, the chances were fairly good that it was something new. So when I saw that the ProMed posting on New Year's Eve, I thought, oh, this is something I need to watch out for. And then I started putting out feelers, and nothing I heard made me feel better, and everything made me, think I needed to start covering it pretty much full time at that point.
And at what point, Helen, did you think the numbers we're being told are the reality in China, and the things being reported to WHO, I'm not believing this?
It's hard for me to pinpoint times, Lori. It happened very quickly, and the numbers jumped quite rapidly. I mean, you'll recall that the first post on ProMed was of 4 pneumonia cases, and within days it was like 44. And they were looking at that the South China seafood market. I may have the name wrong, but that always seemed to me to be probably not where the thing started. It might have been the place where they first spotted it, but it felt like they were looking for their keys under the streetlight, and that did come out, and that did turn out to be true. In the early part of January, it was hard to know where this was going. It did feel like the reassurances out of China that there wasn't person-to-person spread seemed to be unrealistic. It's like, how do you get these many cases if you don't have person-to-person spread? I would say that definitively the point at which it became really clear the problem was huge was when they put Wuhan on lockdown, which I believe was on January 20th. I mean, nobody does that if they can get away with it. I mean, you don't quarantine tens of millions of people unless you have a huge problem.
Yeah. Well, David Culver, you're really a political reporter. You covered the whole gamut of China-related news, everything from, GDP growth one day to naval maneuvers in the South China Sea. And with so much on your plate in December and January, and in particular at a time when the uprisings were going full tilt in Hong Kong, with increasing signs of repression coming down from Beijing, what was it that told you, and when did you feel that what was going on in Wuhan required your attention?
Hey, Lori, and it's good to be with you. Coming to you from Shanghai right now, in one of what is my many pop-up stations that I take around with me, because this is the reality we're living in, right? It's interesting hearing you talk to Helen about her December tweet, and you're mentioning of Hong Kong, because that's actually where I was. I was there backfilling, helping some of my colleagues with what was going to be a New Year's Day protest. This was one of the many pro-democracy protests that was going on. And we started to see some of the mentions of a virus spreading. We weren't quite sure what exactly it was all about. And when I returned into mainland China, probably in early January, we began to discuss, all right, perhaps we need to delve a little bit deeper as to what's happening in Wuhan. And in particular, what Helen mentioned, that Huanan seafood market, what was believed to be the original ground zero. And admittedly, I was not the first to raise my hand to say, yeah, let's go to Wuhan. I'm all about that. I wanted to see first what was playing out a little bit. But I think that's what makes this award so special for me, is that it went to not just me, but my team, because I had a producer and a photographer who were both had been here, one of them his entire life, the other 10 years, and who said, we need to go there and see this ourselves in order to really understand how this is playing out and what the real impact of this is going to be. It wasn't until we were on the ground, Lori.
I want to show the audience a couple of quick clips. And before we do that, what day is it that you jump on the high-speed train from Beijing several hundred miles to Wuhan? What day is that? That's January.
Yeah, it's January 20th.
January 20th.
So actually, I take that back. It's the 21st. It was the 20th that we started our final planning. Is the 21st, and Wuhan goes on lockdown the 23rd of January.
Right. So let's go to that clip, please.
Sure.
So this is where authorities believe the source of the coronavirus is. It's the wildlife and seafood market. And you can perhaps see over there, it's cordoned off. You've got police at all the corners. It is so sensitive that within minutes of us arriving and recording, security asked us to stop filming. So police just asked us to leave the market area. They said we have to get official permission, and once we get that permission, we can come back. The reality is we won't be granted that permission. So instead, we're able to drive now through it, but you can see they've closed off the entire market area. No shopping is going on, no business whatsoever. It's just empty. We're hearing from a doctor who's sharing his story and his early attempts to try to sound the alarm about this, what was then a mystery illness. It got him in trouble with police, but now he's become increasingly popular here on Chinese social media in particular, and in state media. They consider him a hero of sorts. In a matter of days, Dr. Li Wenliang went from treating patients to becoming one. The 34-year-old ophthalmologist diagnosed Saturday with the Wuhan coronavirus. But if action had been taken when he and others started sounding alarms, the severity of the outbreak might have been understood sooner. Struggling to communicate, Li spoke with CNN briefly by phone. You can hear the hospital machines pulsing in the background.
Well, and of course, Li Wenliang went on tragically to die of the disease and became, for a short while, a national hero until government censorship pretty much pulled down everything on Weibo and other major social media about him and sought to change the narrative. Now, if we had stuck with that first clip and followed where that went, you got a pretty fair look at the ground of what was going on in Wuhan. You got some hospital footage. You got a sense of the tension there. And then all of a sudden you get the word, whoa, if we don't get out of town, we're going to be stuck here indefinitely. Wuhan's going on lockdown, and you make the mad race to the train station at 2 in the morning to try and get out of Dodge. Tell us about that. How long were you actually able to report in Wuhan? What was your sense of the city? What did it feel like at that moment? And then what did it take to get safely out of town?
I've covered a lot of hurricanes when I was back in the US, and I described this as getting there ahead of the hurricane, knowing something was coming, not knowing exactly where the eye would make landfall, how strong this was going to be, what we were going to feel impact-wise. And that's exactly the sentiment that I felt when I was in Wuhan going down there. Now you got to remember, we were planning to be down there for about a week. We thought, okay, we'd have a good amount of time to news gather, get what we need. The reality is we were only there for 36 hours because, as you mentioned, it was that phone call that we got from my senior producer who was in Beijing at 3 a.m. And when I answered it, he said, and he's a very calm person, but he said, it's going on lockdown. You got to get out. And I remember in that mind thinking, my mind in that moment thinking, okay, how do we get out? Can we get out? Can we even get a ticket out? Are other people going to be doing the same thing? Because we're talking about a city that's larger population wise than New York. So we knew there would be a rush to the train station. So after we had gathered those elements, we didn't know that was all we were going to gather, but they ended up being crucial amounts of information that we were able to bring back with us to Beijing. And then you saw, Lori, in that clip, that second part, that we were continuing our reporting. Well, that was in the midst of quarantine. And now everyone says, oh yeah, we've done quarantine and we were doing work from home. Well, that wasn't a thing when we were doing it. We started our quarantine as soon as we got back into Beijing, January 23rd, when the rest of the world was continuing on with their daily lives as it was pre-COVID. So it was a rather new thing. And it was CNN who said, no, you're going to stay 14 days in a hotel and you're going to keep away from everyone else just to be safe. So it was a very different reality that we were kind of navigating.
Seems kind of quaint now after most
I know.
Your lockdown forever. It's interesting that the three of you all have strong foreign ties. Helen is Canadian. David's mother is from Cuba, and he grew up in a bilingual household. And Ed, of course, grew up in Malaysia and then, had the gumption to take studies at Cambridge and get his advanced degree there at Cambridge. And Ed is well-grounded in science as his background that he brings to reporting. And I think it's interesting that, all three of you have the opportunity to look at America and America's response to this epidemic with what must be a fair amount of astonishment, particularly, Ed growing up in Asia and thinking of the United States as, whatever, the leader of the free world, the wealthiest country on the planet, blah, blah, blah. And then you wrote this piece that probably is your most famous piece from 2020. In which you ask, how did it come to this? A virus 1,000 times smaller than a dust mote has humbled and humiliated the planet's most powerful nation. America has failed to protect its people, leaving them with illness and financial ruin. It has lost its status as a global leader. It has careened between inaction and ineptitude. The breadth and magnitude of its errors are difficult in the moment to truly fathom. Ooh, strong words. Talk to us about what it felt like to see, the great America flounder so extraordinarily. You're muted.
Well, of course, I'm not American, but I do know that one thing Americans truly love is having British people tell them what to do. And of course, I leapt at the opportunity to do that at the Atlantic. I think the Global Health Security Index, which I'm sure we're familiar with here, in the time before the pandemic, ranked every country according to how prepared they were for a pandemic, according to a number of different indicators. And according to that index, the US was the best prepared of all nations. It was number one in the world. It should have, more than any other country, been able to hold the fort during a crisis such as this. And, I think a lot of people hoped that it would. Helen wrote a magnificent piece about the year of magical thinking, in which many, even seasoned veterans of past epidemics, to believe and hope that a country like America would be able to handle a crisis like COVID. But that was not to be. And I think that's one of the most crucial questions to be thinking about as we think about what the last year has taught us, not just in terms of America's response, but arguably the entire Western world, how it underperformed against resources and expectations. One source I spoke to at the WHO talked about the difference between capacities and capabilities, about how a lot of countries like the US had capacities, resources, technologies, access to biomedical expertise, but not necessarily capabilities to actually deploy those well in a crisis. The on the ground experience that countries that had experiences with things like SARS and other past epidemics had and used to their advantage. And I think that if you look at that index, the Global Health Security Index, and where different countries were ranked, and you compare that to the actual death tolls that those countries experienced from COVID, there's almost no correlation. Like the correlation between those two things is laughably small, which suggests, I think, that not only was much of the world unprepared, but that much of the world didn't know that it was unprepared. That our ability to assess how well countries are skilled for epidemics is very weak. Like either we have the wrong, we're assessing them in the wrong metrics, or we're combining those metrics in the wrong way. And that's I think, a really key point of reckoning for the entire world going forward. Like, how do we actually, like, if COVID took so many supposedly well-prepared countries off guard, then what does that mean for the future? And how can we stop ourselves from being taken off guard again?
Well, let me ask you something about that as a follow-up. I mean, you wrote that article, you published it in August.
Right.
And that, of course, was at the peak of the presidential elections. And Donald Trump was still the president of the United States at that time. Shortly after your article came out, Donald Trump himself came down with COVID. And it has been tempting to blame Donald Trump and his cronies for most of the failures that you highlighted in your article. And certainly we've seen a very, very different response since January 20th of 2021 with President Biden's administration. But if you really go back and take a sober look at this global security index and this sort of hubris problem shared, as you say, not just American, but the entire wealthy world, from Japan to Sweden to Italy to the UK, you name it. How would you now parse how much of it was politics, Donald Trump et al., and how much of it was just America wasn't ready?
Yeah, it's a bit of both, right? A bit from column A, a little from column B. The piece that you talked about, and the one that asked how it came to this, that we published in August, Donald Trump features in that story, but he's not the central core of it. I mean, he doesn't even appear really in the piece until I think it's something like 2/3 of the way through. And that was a deliberate move on our part. It was in recognition of the fact that I do still believe that Donald Trump was a central character in this. You know, his spread of misinformation, his deepening of the polarized divides in America, just his rank ineptitude and his many character flaws, I think all exacerbated the COVID-19 problem in the US. But to blame, you know, if we come out of this and our analysis is, well, it was just Donald Trump, then I think we have catastrophically failed in our ability to learn from this crisis. And we've taken absolutely the wrong lesson. You know, a lot of people, after that piece came out, you know, responded to the cover image and the headline, how did it come to this, by saying, 2 words for you, Donald Trump, and you know, other witticisms of that nature. And I think that just, it spectacularly fails to actually answer the question, like to really understand how COVID laid America so low. Sure, politics are part of it, but you also have to understand the nation's history of racism. You need to understand its prison system, its nursing homes. You need to understand the nation's psychological character, like how it thinks about technology as savior, how it thinks about its duty of care to the vulnerable. You need to think about the social media platforms that allowed misinformation to cascade faster than actual information could travel. you need to think about all these things, like laterally across every aspect of society and into the past.
It's interesting as you say this, Ed, that I mean, your home country, Malaysia, has had a very minimal COVID problem.
Yeah, I think there are a lot of countries that we could look at for as exemplars of good responses. I wrote another piece where I talked about Vietnam and Rwanda as two great examples of countries that had the kind of capabilities that I mentioned. And above all else, I think that two things. One is that they took the problem seriously. I talked to a physician who works in Boston who traveled to Rwanda in the early days of the pandemic and went through a multitude of different checks, had temperature checked, had all kinds of information recorded about his travels, and then did similar flights in the US, and absolutely nothing happened. There was a seriousness with which I think many countries took the pandemic right from the start, and I think these nations also had a much stronger public health system. They had healthcare systems that weren't just geared towards expensively treating people at the very sickest point of their illnesses, but instead were geared towards preventing those illnesses at the community, like actually stopping the spread of epidemics rather than allowing them to run riot and just treating people at the end of that process. There are many lessons that countries that are supposedly leaders on the world stage, like the US and the UK, really ought to be learning from the events of last year.
But our wealthy ignorance will probably keep us from learning those lessons. Helen, back to you. Our mutual friend John Cohen from Science Magazine coined a phrase, the COVID fire hose. And it was a reference to, rolling out of bed in the morning, turning the computer on, and the fire hose of information starts pouring down, and it goes until you collapse and go back to sleep at night. And it was such a torrent of information, often completely unvalidated or unvalidatable. How did you cope with that?
I'm not certain. I still find, frankly, I don't feel like I know as much as I need to know to be comfortable with, on a minute by minute basis. I feel like there's just so much information, and I wish I had the capacity to take more of it in and retain more of it. It was really tough in the beginning. I mean, poor John lives on the West Coast, so he was getting up, I believe, at 4:30 in the morning or something like that to start his shower under the fire hose. It was crazy, and especially in the early days, it was just flying at you from all directions, hard to verify, hard to get, good information. I remember very specifically, like in late January and February, trying to figure out why people weren't moving more quickly, like why we weren't responding more quickly. I particularly thought that it just seemed so evident that we were on the precipice of a really big problem, and not even on the precipice. We'd already fallen off the cliff, and people were acting so slowly, which is the inspiration for the piece that I wrote that Ed mentioned a couple of minutes ago about the magical thinking thing. I think everybody struggled to try to stay on top of this and figure out what it meant.
Let me ask you and Ed together, because one of the hallmarks of this epidemic is that unlike I've been in more than 30 epidemics in my career, and I've never seen anything like this one, because we were deluged with preprints, which to bring our audience up to speed on what that means, these are alleged scientific research papers that no one has refereed. There's never been any scrutiny from peers to say, this is valid or this is invalid, or this is just bad math, or, you didn't even have a control group, or whatever it might be. For the first time as reporters, there are days when the majority of the things that we're gleaning through have actually not been submitted to or subjected to full-blown peer review. And so we're in the position, in a way, of having to do the peer review ourselves, to call other scientists and say, what do you think of this? And do you think this is valid? And to make determinations. And just to frame this before the two of you respond, these are not trivial issues. These are issues that mattered in terms of whether people wore a mask or not, whether they thought hydroxychloroquine was a good treatment or not, whether or not they thought it was safe to go to a restaurant or to take this drug or that drug. In other words, these weren't just, banal academic debates. These were things that real people were making decisions, life and death decisions about. And we, as the journalists, had to parse through them before they'd been adequately reviewed. And this continues. And I wonder how both of you cope. How do you reach your conclusions? What algorithms do you use to decide what preprints are valid and what are problematic? Why don't you start, Helen, since you're on full view right now?
Yeah, the preprints thing that's been a real challenge here, and at the same time, it has to be said that the sharing of information as quickly as possible, one can't fault people for trying to do that. I mean, this is a system that's been established to try to get important data to the world faster. The problem is that amongst the important data are things that aren't really data, or there are, papers that are theories. Certainly early on in the pandemic, a lot of people who had at the beginning of the pandemic, we probably could have had a meeting of the world's coronavirus experts in a pretty small room. It wasn't a huge group of people, and all sorts of people dove into the field. Obviously, it was necessary, but people were looking at this new virus through the lens of whatever it was that they had studied up until then. And many of them made important contributions, but some of them made errors. And, it was tough. I mean, we at STAT, I had the leeway. I was fortunate. I suspect Ed will say the same. There were papers we just didn't cover because even though everybody was jumping on them, we just felt like, this is not good science, or this is not ready for prime time, and we just didn't cover them.
How about you, Ed?
Yeah, I agree with Helen. I think we made a decision quite early on to move away from covering individual papers as the sort of atomic unit of science journalism. I don't think I wrote a piece about an individual paper or preprint over the course of the pandemic. Like, what we tried to do at The Atlantic was to answer big service-minded questions that people were asking. Like, how did it come to this? How will the pandemic end? Things that were not just about going after one paper or another. But, I do want to say that I think that the preprint debate is actually a red herring. Like, even when we write about peer-reviewed papers, we are still doing our own peer review, right? I don't write about a paper without sending it past 4 or 5 other sources to ask for their independent expertise. And I would do that whether I'm writing about a preprint, whether I'm writing about a peer-reviewed paper. Like, I will still do my own form of peer review. And I am a fan of the preprint genre. I think that it accelerates the dissemination of knowledge. It has drawbacks, of course, but I think that when bad stories are written about preprints, the fault is not the preprint itself. The fault is the stories, right? The fault is that people have not done the requisite journalism to actually make sense of what those publications are saying or to give them adequate scrutiny. And I think that if you look over the past year, a lot of terrible work made it through peer review. The paper that kickstarted the hydroxychloroquine nonsense was published in a peer-reviewed journal. The retracted papers by Surgisphere appeared in the most eminent medical journals of our time. Just a bunch of nonsense made it to peer review, as it often does, which is why we do things like run papers by our sources, whether they have been previously peer reviewed or not. And I think that instinct stood the best and most experienced science journalists it left them in a good position over the pandemic. I think it's journalism that matters, not whether something's true.
It's a really interesting point. And Helen hinted at another point in all this. We had a lot of instant experts suddenly emerge, and many of them were actually people that were just very skilled at social media. They became stars on Twitter or Instagram or whatever was their chosen platform, and suddenly just had a whole heck of a lot to say. I remember one in particular was absolutely sure that she knew what the case fatality rate was in China, and that she'd done the math and calculated it. To which I said, but how do you know that any of the data that you're basing this on is accurate? That China's giving real numbers on numbers of cases, on mortality, on recovery. I mean, you're drawing conclusions that will affect all policy down the road, if everybody believes you, based on God knows what. But we saw a lot of these instant experts, and many of them continue to play a prominent role even now, who, as Helen hinted, had not had a background in coronaviruses or perhaps even in epidemiology and basic infectious diseases, but rose to considerable prominence, not based on an Ed Yong story or a Helen Branswell story, but based on the sort of general plethora of news out there and perhaps a lot of lazy reporting. How did you counter that? Did that ever become a significant issue for you?
Do you want me to?
Go ahead, Ed, and then we'll take it back to Helen.
I think choosing your sources wisely is always one of the fundamental tasks that we have to do. I think that it is. I think it's reasonably clear and easy to spot people who are mining Twitter for fame and prominence versus those who are actually sharing deep and valuable expertise. And I think much has been said about the nature of expertise in the pandemic and about epistemic trespassing and people veering out of their lanes. I think one really important thing to remember is that, look, it's a pandemic, right? It's an omni crisis. It affects every aspect of society and demands expertise from every area of society. So in the pieces that I wrote, I was talking to sociologists and anthropologists and linguists and historians, not just epidemiologists and immunologists. Helen is absolutely right that the number of coronavirus experts in the world pre-COVID was incredibly small, which is of course something to bear in mind if you're writing about the science of coronaviruses, right? But if to report on the pandemic, I think one needs to draw on experts from with a wide range, and people who know coronaviruses ins and outs might not know about the other areas that I talked about that are necessary for understanding the impact of the pandemic. The impact of racism, of discrimination, of nursing homes and prisons, and all the rest of it. I think one of the real challenges for doing reporting on this was just that it was about everything. It really was about everything. It's not just about viruses.
Yeah, that's a really good point. At a point last spring, my colleague Sharon Begley, who sadly died earlier this year, wonderful and hugely talented. She Sharon came up with this story that I she said she came up with a story that people were being put on ventilators. People with severe COVID were being put on ventilators too soon. And I was like, what? Where'd you hear that? And she had been talking to a pulmonologist that she knew about something else. And he mentioned this. And I, at that point, was talking with public health people and, the WHO and coronavirus experts and mining different parts of the story. But as Ed points out, I mean, it was a story that involved everybody. And if you didn't talk to a pulmonologist, you might not have understood that they were starting to think about, not going there unless they really, really had to, because the, number of people who came off ventilators was not huge. And so if they could delay it and improve your chances of survival, it was the appropriate thing to do. One of the challenges of this story, and I'd like to hear David's point of view, because we haven't included him for a little bit, and I'm sure he faced
questions for him
similar and also different challenges, is the story was so massive. It was just like, what do I cover? I don't know about you, Ed, but I woke up most days feeling like an abject failure, because I'd read what other people had written and thought, why didn't I write that? Why didn't I write that? And you just couldn't keep, I mean, I was producing as fast as I could, but there was just so much to say. And the other thing about it was so hard to reach people. I mean, we can talk about good journalists and good science journalists and know that, we know to kick the tires, and we always kick the tires and whatnot. But everybody turned into a science journalist last year, and all sorts of people who didn't have, the contacts that Ed and I have, were trying to write about these stories and trying to find people to speak to. And it's not at all surprising that, some of the instant experts that you were alluding to, Lori, would pop up. It is ever thus. There is always going to be somebody who figures out, hey, there's a lot of attention to be gained right now, and if my cell phone number is out there, I'll get some of it. There are people I won't use because I see them that way, but I can't really fault, a reporter who doesn't have some of the cell phone numbers that I have for, you had to find people to talk to. In March last year, it was incredibly difficult. I have lots of contacts, and all of them had, put on automatic replies on their emails. Is just like, I may or may not see this email.
Yeah.
It was a very difficult time to report.
It was. And I just want to remind the audience, I see that quite a number of questions have already come in. If you hear things that you want to ask questions about, you write your questions in the Q&A section down at the bottom of your screen. David, you're dealing with a whole other area of how do you get information, which is that you're sitting there in China, a place that controls information probably more closely than any other place on the planet right now. And I was struck by two things. One was I ran across some posters that were tacked up all over Beijing and Wuhan back in November 2019. And they depicted a kind of a evil superhero kind of cartoon character. And he's wearing a mask, and he's got a look in his eyes like malevolent. And the slogan from the Communist Party was, "Be patriotic, don't wear a mask." And this was because of the artificial intelligence facial recognition technology that China has put all over every street corner, every niche and nook and cranny of China in order to monitor people's movements. So before COVID happens, a mask is unpatriotic. I was struck that in one of your reports, you note that Chinese authorities blocked the broadcast of CNN in China during the time when you were on the air. And it was reminiscent that in 2003, I was reporting from China and during the SARS epidemic, and in fact was on the rooftop of CNN headquarters in Beijing doing a two-way with Atlanta. And as soon as I said China's underreporting the numbers, every TV in China that was on CNN went black screen. And from then on, every time CNN interviewed me, every TV in China would go to black as soon as they gave my name. So I wonder about how you deal with sifting information right there in the middle of it all, and with censorship and with threats against your staff, particularly your Chinese national staff, when you're trying to report something that is so volatile as this issue.
You know, we are quite used to going to black here and watching the censorship take us off the air. I mean, it's just, I think now can be rather habitual for them to take me off as soon as I come on the air, just not sure what I'm about to report on. It's a challenge. Look, I mean, getting this information, I'm listening to Helen and Yong and Ed soak in kind of what they went through and trying to get some of the data and talking about, you know, what even you're relying on and the frustration of not even being sure if it's accurate. This is something we were dealing with. And I have no medical background whatsoever. And Helen talked about the contacts that she had over years of experience. I likewise lacked those. And so you're just trying to observe and take in and learn at the same time as all this is playing out. And yet, are you learning from the accurate amount of data? Here's what we knew at the time was based on anecdotal experience. It was the reality that moms and dads and sons and daughters were telling us our loved ones had all of these symptoms. We know that they had to have had this virus because of where they were in Wuhan, who they were in contact with, and yet their death certificate does not say that they died from this virus. And they showed us all the information. We heard this continuously. So we knew when it comes to the numbers, and this was a question, Lori, that I got multiple times, are the numbers adding up? Are the numbers adding up? No, they were not. We know that. And part of that was, in fairness to the Chinese, they didn't have the proper testing at the time, right? They didn't know exactly what they were testing for in some hospitals in Wuhan. And then after the fact, when they did not go necessarily back to change all of those accounts to say they were in fact COVID-19 patients. Now they did do some revisions, 2 by our count, to move up the numbers, but not nearly to the place where I think most believe that they should have been. All in all, though, it's a continuous challenge to try to figure out what data we're getting is accurate, but that's where we just try to rely as best as possible on the experiences of humanity, to be quite blank.
And what did you do in terms of, well, first of all, were you aware, was reporting coming through to you that Taiwan was the success story? Are people on the mainland at all aware of how dramatically Taiwan has controlled COVID?
You know, it was interesting. We had read a report early on about a team of experts that came from Taiwan and went to Wuhan. And this was really before the lockdown. And they were kind of observing and taking things in. And when they went back, said, okay, this is not as it's being portrayed. We need to tighten up our controls of this. And I reflected my own travels in the region. I flew to Japan, to Tokyo, January 12th or so. So this was 10, 11 days before the Wuhan lockdown. And even as I arrived there were signs saying, if you're coming from mainland China, and they took me going from Beijing, they put me in a separate line. And those of us on our aircraft went to a separate line and went through different screenings. So I think not only in Taiwan, but in the region, people started to be a bit more skeptical in reading in how exactly this was playing out. But Taiwan, you know, the self-governed democracy, of course, China considers it part of its sovereignty, was handling this very differently. And you know, geographically, they have the advantage, and population-wise, a lot smaller than most other countries. They're able to change their approach and how, of course, they're going to be screening people, and they were effective in that. It obviously did not play out that way. I mean, Helen said something that to me just put me back in that mode of a year ago, and that was the frustration of watching how things were playing out in other parts of the world, including in the US. And I remember going through my own Instagram and seeing my own family and friends and going into these social settings, and I'm thinking, and this was not a matter of me not having been on the air. I was reporting from quarantine in late January onward. So we were definitely broadcasting what was going on here, but you're thinking, is this not being received? What's happening? How is this not being understood? And why is action not being taken? I mean, it was frustration that I was feeling at a very personal level. And yet you had to continue on saying, well, perhaps it is just here. Maybe it is just going to stay in this, part of Wuhan or China. So, I mean, those were very human and real frustrations.
It must have been hugely frustrating to you to see
Yeah.
that moment when President Trump says we're going to shut down flights from Wuhan. And in the United States, the CDC has this algorithm that says, if you've traveled from Wuhan and you have a temperature, ... And yet there's plenty of Americans getting out of Wuhan and coming back to the United States. And some 40,000 people, in fact, did travel from the Wuhan area back to the United States and spawned the outbreak in Washington State and other locations around the United States. It must have felt really strange from your side of this.
Incredibly strange, frustrating. I mean, at times you felt hopeless, but it wasn't, you're right, it wasn't just the fact that it was shut down from Wuhan, because you could have traveled from Wuhan to Beijing and then out through Shanghai, where I am. I mean, there were so many other routes. I mean, Wuhan was a major, and still is a major, transportation hub in this country. And so the ways that it likely was able to spread well beyond that city and Hubei province as a whole, there's a multitude. But yeah, that frustration is something I still kind of go back to and think, the what ifs. Obviously, you can't linger and live in that. But now I think going forward, it's something that is an awareness as you're continuing to report on this and trying to push out with an urgency, not a sensationalism, but an urgency to say, no, wait a minute, we need to be paying attention to this. We can't dismiss this. Right.
Well, I want to go back to Helen because there's this number that blows my mind, and the number is 147. That is the number of stories that Stat says you wrote about COVID between January 4, 2020 and January 4, 2021. My God. Woman, you survived this.
Yeah, I was 15 when I started. I've seen this number. I haven't tried calculating it myself. I kind of have a hard time believing it, but it was a really busy year. It was a really busy year. Well,
can I ask you a specific thing about that? Because one of the things we all know is that when we're working at a huge pace on things, it becomes easier to make sloppy mistakes. We're exhausted. We've got too much coming at us all at once. And I know that you, in particular, of all reporters I know, you are such a stickler for accuracy. And it's a make or break for Helen Branswell. How in the world do you do 147 stories and you're burning the candle at both ends? It's 24/7 journalism. How do you not make a mistake? How do you keep yourself?
I make mistakes. There are correction notes on the bottom of too many of my stories. First of all, if that number is true, that I wouldn't have written all of those stories by myself. Many of them I would have co-written with people like Sharon or people like Drew Joseph, who's a phenomenal reporter that we have, who's done a lot of our COVID coverage, or Matt Harper, one of my colleagues with whom I write a lot of vaccine stories. And we have excellent editors. I work with an editor named Jason Euchman, who is just a phenomenal editor. And I'm very, very lucky in that. And, I can't, I'm not sure I can tell you more. It's just, you try your hardest and you work with good people, and you're really lucky if you get to work with really good people.
Well, I think the external pressures on the journalist are something that we tend to try and graciously downplay or say, well, we have lovely colleagues. But Ed, you have lovely colleagues, and your institution went through layoffs. You're right in the middle of all the COVID madness, and the Atlantic went into a grave financial situation. Talk about what that meant for you.
Yeah, I probably don't want to talk about our layoffs, especially out of respect for friends and colleagues who were laid off during that time. It is a difficult time to do journalism, full stop. We are all stressed. The industry is in a rough space. I was grateful to The Atlantic for giving me the space and the time and the support I needed to do the kind of work I did. I completely agree with Helen that it's very lovely to win these awards as individuals, but the work wasn't individual work. Right? Like I didn't have shared bylines, but I did have immense support from editors, from our fact checkers, from our copy editors, who saved my ass many times over. And I'm very grateful for that. I think that the Atlantic, like all journalism institutions, was trying to work out how to survive in this modern era, how to do the best possible journalism we could. I think that we tried very hard to do journalism that would serve the public. So rather than just doing as many stories as possible, to do stories that would have an impact, that would actually address and answer the questions that people were having. And I think that we showed last year that there is a market for good, deep, thoughtful journalism. I wrote definitely not 147 stories. Dear God, Helen. But a lot of long, very long magazine-length features back to back. And I think if you'd told me that that was how I would approach the pandemic in January of 2020, I would probably have laughed. And if you told me that I would do that and that people would read those pieces, I would probably also have been a little suspicious. So I think that we had a large influx of new subscribers, and I know Stat did as well, because of the strength of this approach. And I think it shows that if we rise to the occasion, and if we do our work, and if we stay true to the best tenets of our field, that we can produce work that people will actually read and consume and want to see.
Well, I have about 200 more questions, but we are approaching the time when we will open it up to the Q&A from the audience. So I just want to throw one last question at all of you. And I'll throw it to you, Ed, first, but I'd love to hear all three of you on this. Back in May of last year, so 11 months ago, Ed, you wrote a story about variant forms of the virus. And you were very dismissive in the piece of Betty Korber from Los Alamos National Laboratories. You said there's no clear evidence that the pandemic virus has evolved into significantly different forms, and there probably won't be for months. And you said that the misconceptions about dangerous strains are also seductive in their own right, and went on to talk about how that supplies an excuse for failures in the actual organization of response and behavior, social distancing, and so on. But now, of course, we know that, first of all, Betty was right, that there was this D variant and now, in fact, pretty much every strain in circulation in the world is descendant from that branch. And we now have the B117, AKA UK variant. We have the P1, AKA Brazilian variant, the B1351 South African. We have two variants out of California. We have the B1526 mutant here in New York. 80% of all new infections in New York City are variant strains. We have just learned today from the CDC that the majority of all new infections in America are variant strains. And we have just had the announcement of what's being called a super variant, a super mutant found on the Tanzania-Angola border that appears to have mutated multiple sites on the spike protein, which is the protein, for those of you out there that aren't aficionados on this is the protein used both to gain entry into cells to infect them, but also that triggers antibody responses hopefully from us so that we don't get infected. And so we're in this crazy period now where a lot of people are already talking rear view mirror about this pandemic as if, it's over. Ha ha, we won. And meanwhile, we're in a mad race to vaccinate faster than the variants can spread in hopes that somehow we'll forestall the possibility of a South African-like variant emerging that really undermines our vaccines. So, and we have tremendous disequity in access to vaccines, particularly when we look at it at a global scale. So to the three of you, look ahead. And I want to make it a reasonable question. So I'm just going to ask you to look as far as September 2021. Where are we by then? What are you going to be watching for that's going to tell you either, yes, the current strategy is going to work, and I can feel confident that the vaccines will beat the variants and we'll get this puppy under control, and somehow COVAX will suddenly miraculously get the billions of dollars it needs to go out and vaccinate all of the rest of the world? Or no, I see these signals that tell us that we're heading towards not only a fourth wave, but perhaps towards a very dangerous pivot that will involve vaccine-resistant escape mutations. So let's take it. Let's start with David, go to Ed, and then end with Helen.
September 2021. Where am I? Probably here in China still. Here's what I'm looking at. I'm looking at the border. I'm looking at when China will start to reopen travel. And I know that because, not only for personal reasons, of course, I would like to get home to visit family after more than, a year and a half, nearly 2 years, but for a broader reason. And that is, I know that China will be hesitant to open its borders unless they are near 100% guaranteed that this virus is not going to continue to spread domestically. Now, regardless of how things played out initially, one thing I can say is that by this time last year, we started to resume life as though it were pre-COVID, domestically, that is. I mean, we were in this bubble and we still are in that bubble. But I am very curious to see where Chinese officials are going to go, because, for one, they are going to want to start allowing travel again because we're nearing the Beijing 2022 Olympics and they want to get back to showing things in a positive light here. However, they're going to be very resistant to do that unless they can guarantee that things are going to be safe here. And right now, what's interesting to watch play out is the vaccination rates, because you look at what's happening, early on here, obviously it was a mess. And then China had the strict lockdowns. They had their contact tracing, the QR codes that we live with every day here. And they were able to kind of get back on board with things. However, now they seem to be falling behind on the vaccination level, and they know that. And they're not even looking at near 70% until early spring 2022. So if anything changes between now and then, I'd be surprised. But September 2021, I think we're likely still with these travel restrictions.
Ed.
So, I think throughout the pandemic, I've tried to make a policy of not speculating about things without having done the reporting, and I'm going to cue to that today too. What I will say is that regardless of how the seesaw between variants and the vaccination plays out over the next half year, the pandemic, defined broadly, isn't going to be over for well beyond that, because everything that we've experienced so far will have lasting consequences on our societies, and on the way we think about epidemics for years and decades to come. The sheer degree of the inequities that the US alone has experienced across dimensions of gender, of race, of ability, these will all continue to cascade and magnify forward. The cost upon our healthcare workforce, the public health workforce, the scientific workforce. Even if COVID just disappears tomorrow, the consequences of all of that, about a year of of incompetence and failure, are just going to continue ramifying. And I think that's sort of what I'm thinking about when I think about the future, in terms when I think about like how to cover the pandemic as a reporter, I'm not just interested in questions of like what proportion of people are going to be vaccinated by what date, but just like what actually is going to be the long-term aftermath of our experience with this virus.
Helen.
I think in the United States, there's going to be, by September, people are going to be trying to put this behind them, trying to pretend it didn't happen and that we've licked it or whatever. It's going to be an interesting time because, we're already having debates about vaccine passports and whether or not anybody's going to be required to show documentation of vaccination. And of course, the US being the individualistic country that it is, and the country where people do not like their liberties to be infringed upon in any way, that's not playing out very well here. But I don't know that it's avoidable. I think, students who are going to go to university in the fall, and especially if they want to live in residence, are probably going to have proof of vaccination or a really good reason why they're not vaccinated. And I think, as the parts of the world that can start to normalize move towards that, I mean, there's going to be the need to sort of have some reciprocity, as David's talking about in terms of opening borders. I mean, people are going to want to know whether travelers are a COVID risk or not. And I think we have some interesting and ethically challenging questions to face going forward there. Another thing I think about in terms of the fall is, especially if people start to, or stop wearing masks and stop distancing to the same degree, I think that some of the respiratory pathogens that haven't affected us much over the last few months are going to come roaring back with a vengeance. Everybody I talk to who works on influenza is very worried about the next flu season. There was a lot of talk last summer about the danger of a twindemic, and that didn't happen this past winter, thankfully. But that means that a lot of people haven't encountered influenza for over a year now. The susceptible pool has grown, and we could have a fairly harsh flu season next year as well. RSV and other respiratory pathogens that haven't been circulating much could really pick up again. So, it might be a bit of a rough period in the fall.
Well, lots to think about. Wise words and again, the congratulations to our three winners. I would only add that my anxiety is focused on Brazil and India, two gigantic nations with all the issues that Ed brought up of racial dynamic, social dynamic issues that make conquering a problem of this scale monumental. And they've both vaccinated less than 3% of their populations, and they both have now completely out of control epidemics with variants in circulation. So I'm very worried about the possibility of a place like, fill in the blank, the name of the town, India, or fill in the blank, the name of the town, Brazil, serving as a sort of petri dish for the evolution of yet another dynamic and perturbation in this SARS-CoV-2 virus and how it interacts with the human immune system. So on that very happy note, I want to hand it over for our Q&A section. I see we have about 20 questions backed up in the question and answer box already. And so I hand it to you, Ralph. Can we begin to take on some of these questions?
Sure, I'll go ahead and start. Carrie Shankman, I'm a First Amendment attorney. Congratulations to you all, and thank you to the Polk Award Committee who put immense work into this event. My question, has the pandemic impacted your views of the ethical obligations of journalists? And in light of some media that have promoted misinformation that does objective harm, what's the best way to mitigate that while still protecting a robust free press?
Who would like to take that one on? How about you, Ed?
Okay. So listen, I think unlike a lot of my colleagues, and perhaps unlike a lot of folk award winners, I didn't come into journalism, from with a long-seated desire to be a journalist. I sort of came into it as a sideways route, as a scientist first, and then someone who was a little bit frustrated with mainstream journalism circa the mid 2000s. So like I sort of came into this through a weirdly lateral and slightly antagonistic route. So I feel like, my views about like the ethics of journalism and what the pandemic means for it are sort of exactly the same as they were about 20 years ago. I talked about the need to seek independent comment for things like for papers, whether they're preprints or not. I talked about the need to avoid speculating on social media or other formats without having done the reporting. And I hold to all of those things. And I think that sometimes the failures of of our profession that came out through the pandemic, have always been there, right? The COVID didn't create new problems. COVID only exacerbated and exploited existing problems, and that is true in every society. And I think it's true for the media as well. I think it shows us where we are weak and where we could do better. And I hope that it's a chance for all of us to learn, like to have an introspective moment about like what we need to change.
COVID as salt on the wounds. We can take the next question. Unmute yourself, please.
Hi, thank you so much for this. My name is Vicki Madden, and I work in New York City Public Schools, which is an adventure right now. Open 2 days, closed for 10, open 4 days, closed for 10. As I was listening to you all, I thought, as somebody who grew up in the days of 3 major networks plus PBS, and now we live in this landscape of, kind of choose your own adventure news sources. And I wonder how, whether what might have been different, or how you feel like that our current state of, people be able to really curate and tailor their own news sources has, impacted the situation.
Great question. And I'm going to have David take it on, because it's often pitted as a world of CNN versus Fox. David.
I know. And it's, I don't know, I kind of have this love-hate when it comes to all the different forms of media. I mean, be it social, be it mainstream, be it state-controlled. Vicki, thanks for your question, and thanks for your work in education too. I think the way I look at it is ultimately, this choose your own type of journalism can actually be beneficial. And the reason I say that is because even this conversation that we're having here, I mean, the way I look at it is with social media in particular, is we've gone back to the roots of journalism, where it was coffee houses and bars, it was dialogue. It wasn't the main 3 networks, an anchor, oftentimes a very scripted report talking to a muted audience, right? I think we've kind of brought back the conversation aspect of that. Now with that allows for misinformation, and that's obviously a dangerous part of it. One thing, I will say is when you kind of go back to how we began this conversation here with my clip from Wuhan, that was actually on Facebook that first clip started to go out. And that was in many ways a test for us to see, what interest was in this then mystery illness. And that clip alone got more than 200 million views. It was the most watched hard news video on Facebook of all time. I mean, so that to us in that moment said, all right, clearly there's interest. Clearly people are trying to follow this and get more information. Let's now meet those demands and see what we can do in digging up more. But ultimately there is a lot of information out there. And sometimes, admittedly, I myself just have to kind of shut off one or many other of the outlets just to kind of focus my mind, if anything, on silence and stillness, and then kind of come back to and say, all right, how do I now process in a simple way what I need to gather? I mean, Helen at the top of this said, there's just so much information that oftentimes you'd see other people start reporting something and say, oh, I should have gone in on that, or I should have done this. But the reality is sometimes it's the simple mindset and approach that can often be the one that relates most to viewerships and readers.
That's a great answer. Let's take the next question, please. And it's George.
Hi, everybody. Hi, Laurie. How are you?
I'm good.
Good to see everybody. Thank you so much for this, a great conversation. I'm actually an LIU J School grad from class of 73, and I've attended a lot of POC Awards. Congratulations to everybody. As an adjunct at Stony Brook University School of Communication and Journalism, I'll ask this question for my students who have been through a lot the last year and a half. How do you balance, somebody said this involved everything and everyone. So how do you balance your own personal self and self-care and your family and your professional self? They've often asked me that question. I tell them it comes with experience, but David, especially, you were right in the thick of it. So
He's addressed it to you, David. I'd like to hear what Helen would say as well.
Yeah, well, I'll be quick and get to Helen from this. But George, it's it's been a challenge. I think even with more than a decade of news experience, mostly in local news before moving here, this was an adjustment. And I don't think, to be quite honest, it hit me until I hit that 1 year mark of the Wuhan lockdown. And I'll be very blunt with you. I went back there and spoke to families, and now the whole world had felt it by this point. But I was talking to families who believed that things were covered up, that they were angry, and these were Wuhan residents who had lost loved ones, and they would break down in these interviews and just say that they want their daughter or their father or their sibling back. And George, in that moment, especially with one mom in particular, I lost it. I lost it in the interview, and it was a taped interview, and obviously we didn't show that portion on air. But from a very human moment, I think I had to kind of just take a step back and say, all right, you need to process this yourself too. And to my boss's credit, they said, take a breather here. This is, you're a human in the midst of this too. So I think, sometimes journalists have this, want to go in with this approach of saying, separate all emotion from things. Well, that doesn't help my storytelling and make it more relatable. I need to, if anything, tap into those emotions. I don't need to showcase them on air, but process them in a respectful way and put them through my characters and allow them to showcase the reality on the ground here. And I'll turn it to Helen.
I remember a moment when, Helen, you put out a tweet. This was probably about 6 months ago, where you said, is anybody else just dying for a day with a walk in the park? Yeah. And I thought, boy, I feel your pain. How did you get through this, especially because you were running a marathon?
It has been, it has been tough. It's easier now, and harder now in some ways. I'm very tired, but easier now in that, you get into a groove and you know what to expect. And it's also not as dire as it was. I really hit a wall last March or early April. I've been covering it from, the beginning of January. And when it really became clear that this was happening and it was going to be really bad, I had some days, it was just, I had to sort of reach out to my editor and say, I'm not really functioning very well today. You're not really going to get much work out of me. So none of the 147 stories on those days. You just, you do what you can do at a time like that. And then you get up the next day and you might feel a little bit better and you do some more. You find ways to take breathers. I don't know about the others, but for me, when I'm working on a really big story and really immersed in something, it can be hard to take time off. I mean, first of all, there was no time to take time off, but also, when you're running, really fast, you can't just stop, right? It's like stepping off the treadmill while the treadmill is still going too quickly. So figuring out how to sort of wind down enough to be able to handle some time, a little time off or a day or two off, that was a challenge, but it's gotten manageable now.
I have to say, my apartment. I live in Brooklyn, and my apartment is between, on one side, the staging spot for all of the out-of-town EMTs that came from all over the United States and Canada to help New York when we were at our peak this time last year. And on the other side of me is the primary hospital that all those patients were going to. And at times I was counting 15 or 20 ambulance sirens at once. And this was going 24/7. There was a sense of how could everybody not be freaked out? How is it possible that this is going on all around me, and yet there's not a sense of grave concern coming out of the White House and out of the rest of the country? And I think here in New York, we really felt like the world was letting us die off, not paying attention to what we were going through. And that was probably a distorted perception, but it felt that way at the time. And before we came on board, I have to tell the audience that Ed has had this glorious, well, I don't know if glorious is the right phrase, but he's had this marvelous 3 months where he's had to leave from the Atlantic to write a book. And it's on a completely non-COVID topic. And you were saying how you felt like it was recharging your batteries, Ed.
Yeah, I joked in December in some interviews and to friends that it is telling about what pandemic reporting is like that that writing a book in a few months feels like going to a spa. It feels like a deeply rejuvenating and soul enriching activity. I think to George's question, I think what I mainly want to say is, to people who've really struggled over the last year, yeah, because it's a pandemic. It sucks. It was awful. And I think that this sort of applies for a lot of people, for people who, are sort of, I don't know, in charge of families or have lots of responsibilities for employees, or certainly journalists, because of the burdens we put on ourselves. There's almost this meta stress, that you feel like you should be on top of this. Like it's your duty to have your shit together, and then you sort of blame yourself. You start thinking okay, if I meditated more, or I ate better, or I worked out, or went for a walk, I wouldn't feel this bad. But of course you would feel this bad, because it's a bloody pandemic. So I think the main thing I would say is I don't have any tips on self-care. Lord knows I was terrible at it until I took an actual leave, but allow yourself to not be okay. It's not okay that you're not okay, but that is in itself okay, right? You are allowed to feel bad and to struggle, and your institutions and your colleagues and your bosses should help you with that. Like Helen said, I think it's having people who support your mental health as part of who you are and what you contribute to the world was crucial. And I had the benefit of really good editors and a really supportive workplace over the last year. And I think a lot of people didn't have that. And I feel very grateful for that privilege.
We have time for, I think, 2 more questions. Let's take one right now.
Hi, my question is for David, and thank you all for being here and doing this. I always like to go to these Polk presentations pretty much every year. So my question is for David. Did you see 76 Days, the documentary? Especially since, basically they started filming within days of you being there. Did you know it was happening or hear about it at any point?
So it's Doreen, right?
Yes.
I have not seen the documentary, and I say that with a bit of embarrassment, but I know well about what it's all about, and I've read a good amount of what went into it. I didn't know that this was going on at the time. And for those who aren't familiar, this obviously chronicles kind of the medical and the hospital aspect of how things played out, particularly within Wuhan. And 76 days marks that January 23rd lockdown start onward until I think it's April 8th. Actually, yeah, I guess a year ago today, as I think about it, that the lockdown was lifted. We missed that marker. There's the peg. I think one of the things that I take away from all of this too, Doreen, is that there's a geopolitical aspect, and then there's a real human on the ground aspect. And a lot of those doctors and nurses were experiencing that, and people who we spoke with, not only Dr. Li Wenliang, who obviously became, from China's perspective, a martyr, and then from those who were obviously whistleblowers and pushing for more transparency, kind of the face of all of this, but from just everyday nurses and doctors here as well, that, we saw that kind of heroism from the US and other countries and how they were projecting the medical teams. But here that was often overlooked because it was kind of overshadowed by the criticism for the Chinese government. But you have to separate that a bit too and look at the doctors and nurses who really were working day and night tirelessly, going in and not sure what they were stepping into here early on, and sacrificed a lot. And I've spoken to several of them. And in my mind, they're incredible human beings.
We have time for one more question. And this comes from Guy. Please unmute yourself.
Happily. I wasn't expecting to get to tune in. I thought it was just chat, but thanks for taking my question. It really is just about how do any of you retain hope, not just for future pandemics, but for the sake of the future of humanity when you see this kind of spectacular failure and political and inequality and racist forces at work in our society, in America and across the world. Like, if you see that pattern persisting, how do you retain hope for the next pandemics, climate change, anything that requires compassion and science and working together?
That's a great question. And actually, Ed, you had touched on this when you talked about your answer to my question, what does September 2020 look like? And you said, look, we're not looking at the full dimensions of all of this. When you look at the larger set of dimensions, do you see hope?
Yeah, it's very depressing, obviously. There is a lot of, there have been a lot of failures and there's a lot of bad stuff on the horizon. And it can be hard for one's mental health to stare full on at the sun and try and take it all in. But I think in terms of retaining hope, I don't think we have the luxury of nihilism. I don't think we get to abandon the hope that things might be better. I wrote in a piece in April, my wife Liz Neely wrote also about this in the Atlantic and talks about this regularly. This concept called the Stockdale paradox. There was a man named Vice Admiral Stockdale who was a prisoner of war in Vietnam, who when interviewed afterwards about how he survived being a prisoner of war and long stints of solitary confinement, said that he had to, at the same time, maintain an unflinching understanding of the brutal reality of his situation, but also this unwavering hope that things might get better. And that is what's called the Stockdale paradox, staring the problem full in the face, but also believing that that you have the capacity to improve. And Stockdale was talking about people who didn't have that, who sort of felt things will get better, and by Christmas, and they weren't out at Christmas, or I'll be out at Easter, and they weren't out at Easter, and who just died of and succumbed to sorrow and grief. And I think we can't afford to do that. So I try to maintain hope that things can be better, while still also staring our present in the face. And it's hard, but I talked to a colleague, Van Newkirk, who does amazing work for us at the Atlantic about this in March of 2020, and I said, I worry that the pieces that I write don't have any impact, that shouting into the void. And Van said that a really smart thing, which was that if it is true that we can only learn, if it is the case that we only ever learn from hindsight, then someone still has to provide that hindsight. So in our work, we may not shift hearts and minds in the present moment, but we provide the basis by which we can historically judge and make sense of what we're all living through right now. And I think sometimes that's enough. Sometimes that is sufficient to keep me going and just to do the work.
Well, if I had the power, I would ask everybody to unmute and join me in giving applause to our winners of this year's Polk Awards. And I'm going to hand it over to Ralph now to close us out.
A heartfelt thank you to our panelists for their important work and insights. For over 7 decades, the Polk Awards Committee of LIU, an independent body of journalists and academics, has recognized the work of resourceful and courageous journalists, many of them mavericks in the mold of our namesake, George Polk, a CBS reporter who was murdered in Greece in pursuit of a story at the outset of the Cold War. We appreciate the technology that made this webinar possible. Registrants span the country and the globe, but we also look forward to the day post-pandemic when we can again celebrate the work of Polk Prize winners in person at our awards luncheon, and again hold the Polk panel before a live audience. To today's viewers, let's stay in touch. Our website is polk.liu.edu. Thank you for your participation and good night.